All right, guys, this is chapter 3, part 2. This shouldn't take very long. I'm going to fly through this. This is where we left off on the current trends, and this is where we'll start the second half of this lesson on chapter 3, talking about newspapers. Um, Newspapers help fulfill that surveillance function of the mass media, but they also serve or fulfill the correlation and entertainment functions to some extent as well. So newspapers continue to be a really important part of the media sphere in Western societies like the United States and really all societies. I mean, back in Egypt, where I lived for a couple of years, the newspaper industry there is thriving, there's actually a really old and prominent newspaper industry that goes back to the middle of the 19th century there. About 60% of current American newspaper content is advertising. That's a lot. That's actually one of the points of criticism, right? I mean, we're supposed to go to the news to get information, but again, with that theme that we've been talking about, consumerism, we're being taught, it seems, that to buy things, and so advertising is kind of an issue. It's a problem, at least in some folks' minds. One reason why people criticize the heavy reliance on advertising is because newspapers make a lot of their money from ads, and what that ends up doing in some cases it can compromise news content. So for example, if you are an editor at a major newspaper and you want to write a story about corruption, or some bad policy or something bad business at a with a certain corporation that advertises with you. Now, what if that corporation threatens to pull their ads? What are you going to do then? Now, you might think that that's very conspiratorial, but that's actually very common. It happens quite regularly. Newspapers will kind of lay off of their own advertisers, the corporations that advertise with them, that is. And it's the same with other media industries as well. I like to give the example of the magazine industry. In magazines, so I mentioned in a previous lesson that you can't there are no radio or television cigarette advertisements in this country. It's not allowed. So where do the cigarette companies advertise? Where does the tobacco industry advertise? They advertise in newspapers and especially in magazines, right? So if you think back, well, you probably won't remember this, but 15 or 20 years ago, there was huge controversy related to the tobacco industry. The tobacco companies were being accused of kind of suppressing information about the harms of smoking, and they got a lot of bad press. Okay, I mean, it was really scathing. But it was interesting. Some researchers went back and they looked at the critical press coverage of the tobacco industries, and they found that the TV stations, the TV news networks, were very critical of the tobacco industry, but the magazines were not as critical. They just kind of gave light slaps on the wrist. And the best way to explain that is because the tobacco companies advertise in the magazines, and it's hard for the magazines to be overly critical. We don't want to bite the hand that feeds us, so to speak. Um, Most American newspapers serve local communities, like the Times Daily here in the Shoals, but some are national, like the New York Times, the USA Today. There are national newspapers that you can get anywhere. Print circulations have been declining. That's also one of the kind of the recent trends. But digital circulations recently have helped pick up some of the slack. You'll notice that if you go on to, the NewYorkTimes.com or whatever, they'll let you read a few articles for free, but then eventually they'll ask you to subscribe. And that's how newspapers are starting to make, they're starting to rebound financially with some of those digital subscriptions. Just going to go through this brief history of newspapers very quickly. The book, chapter 3, kind of engages in an in-depth treatment of the history of newspapers. I'm just going to highlight some key points here. We had news brochures and pamphlets printed in Germany in the 15th century. Those are the first things that kind of seem to resemble a newspaper. The first newspaper in America was published in 1690 in Boston by a man named Richard Pierce. It was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. Not a very catchy title. Notice how it's spelled also. They used to spell, you know, public and domestic. They've got it's CK at the end instead of just the C, which is how we spell it now. By the way, here's we'll just skip ahead. There's an image. That's what it looked like. Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. That's that Thursday, September 25th, 1690 edition, which ended up being the only edition that was ever published because it was shut down immediately by the British authorities after publication of that first issue, which gives you an indication. Sometimes, this is kind of part of the history of newspapers. In some cases, governments don't like what journalists are doing, what they're saying, and so historically, many governments have tried to kind of suppress news content in one way or the other. I hope that the noises that my kids are making outside are not too great. I hope you can hear me okay. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they're outside in the living room playing. Early on, there were two kinds of papers. You had the commercial papers and the political papers. The commercial papers were published by business people, and they reported on the economy, and the political papers were published by political parties. And this is important to note. The political papers were explicitly partisan. They were not expected to be, balanced and fair and objective. Objectivity is actually, a lot of people don't know this, objectivity is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's about 115 years old. Prior to that, newspaper content was very biased, to use the term that we talked about in one of the previous lessons. It was explicitly biased. If you want to have some fun sometimes, or maybe this is not fun, I guess I'm kind of a nerd, but go to the library and go to the microfilm section and look up a really old copy of the New York Times. The New York Times has been around since, the 1850s, I think. Look at the New York Times from 1870. Just read some edition of the New York Times, some issue of the New York Times, and just pay attention to how different it was. How different things were in terms of how things were reported. You'll notice many differences, and that's one of them. They were very biased. And that was accepted. Let's fast forward to the 19th and 20th century. There was a lot of development. We had technological developments, especially between 1830 and 1930, that really helped facilitate growth in the newspaper industry, and there was a great proliferation of newspapers during that time. One reason why is because the steam-powered printing press was invented. These were very fast, and you could print up to 4,000 sheets an hour on both sides, and it made mass printing possible. Prior to the 1830s, when steam-powered presses were popularized, they were using hand-powered printing presses, and these were extremely slow. It was a very arduous task just to try to print a few copies of a newspaper. Also, subscriptions were replaced in the 1830s and 1840s by mass circulation associated with the penny press. So, prior to the 1830s or 1840s, people would subscribe to the newspaper. They would pay larger amounts of money. It was more expensive, right? And they'd get the newspaper delivered to them every day or every week or whatever. Now, the problem with that from the newspaper industry's perspective is that you're kind of shutting off a huge part of the market, the people that can't afford the subscriptions. So what they did is they introduced this penny press, which was the newspaper that sold for a penny. It was extremely cheap, obviously. Everybody could afford it, and circulation just exploded at that time. Everyone was reading the newspaper. Now, how do they make money then? And that's the key point here, that third to last bullet point. Advertising became the key source of revenue. So that really, the 1830s, the 1840s, that kind of marks a major shift in the history of American newspaper publishing. Benjamin Day published the New York Sun in 1833, selling it for a penny. That was the first penny press newspaper. By 1880, there were more than 11,000 U.S. newspapers. In the late 19th century, yellow journalism was popularized by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They kind of gave the newspaper industry a black eye. What they did, for those that don't know what yellow journalism is, it's basically journalism that's characterized by a high level of sensationalism. Not a lot of accuracy. They were publishing what was exciting, what was titillating. They were publishing a lot of scandal, stuff on, sex and violence and so on and so forth. And they were doing this because they were competing with one another. Hearst and Pulitzer were in this major kind of newspaper war, competing with one another for circulation and for advertisers, right? And they just sensationalized news reports for a period of several years. And it's really a dark era in the history of American newspapers. In fact, some people suggest that Hearst and Pulitzer are the reasons why America went to war in the Spanish-American War. Because one of them, I think this is documented in your book, and I forget which one it was, he famously said, "If you can send me some pictures, I'll give you a war." And he was basically calling on his correspondents in the field to send him some pictures of anything, of whatever, that looked like it might be exciting or juicy, that would suggest war. And that's kind of what he did. He went and he wrote a bunch of stories that were sensationalized, were not grounded in fact, and it propelled, according to some historians, it propelled these two sides into a war. Many scholars argue that newspaper content in many U.S. cities is not diverse enough, and instead it's largely uniform. This is one of the current challenges. It's one of the current criticisms of newspapers. You should know what a joint operating arrangement is. It's a legal agreement that permits newspapers in the same market or city to merge their business operations for economic reasons. It's kind of an example of concentration, and critics believe that joint operating arrangements negatively impact diversity of opinion. So again, we get that narrowing of voices. This is one of the challenges with newspapers. Another challenge is with respect to advertising. As I already mentioned, newspapers have to pay the bills. They have mouths to feed, right? It's not cheap to put out a newspaper and to pay all those employees. So they have to secure advertising. And that's one of the potential problems, is that newspapers then have to cater to advertisers, and they also have to cater to what the public wants. And sometimes members of our public, not to be overly negative, but a lot of us are, not as interested in information as we are in entertainment. And so people want sensationalized news reports. The reason newspapers give us sensational reporting is because people want sensational reporting. So where newspapers won't succumb to public pressure, though, they'll succumb to the competitive pressure because they need to compete, they need to gain circulation so that they can gain advertisers. And that's what newspapers do. They sit down, they have divisions, departments that are responsible for securing advertising, right? Sales departments. And that's what the salespeople do. They sit down with these corporations and they say, look, our newspaper is distributed to this many people on Monday, and this many people on Friday, and this many people on Sunday, and we think it would be a good idea for you to advertise with us, and this is the cost of our advertising, and it would be, you'd get a good return on investment. And they have to sell that, and one of the problems now too is back in the day, the way it was, and this is also mentioned in your book. I forget which chapter. It might be this chapter, another chapter. But one of the issues is back in the day, they used to write all the news, fill up as much as they could, and then with whatever space was left over, they would advertise. Now it's the opposite. they advertise, they secure as many advertisements as they can get, and then in the leftover space, they publish news. So you can see how things have been flipped by this profit-making reality. The internet represents a major threat to newspapers. You and I, we can just log on to the internet, go to Google News or Yahoo News or one of these news aggregate sites or whatever, and we can read news reports. We don't need to get to have a subscription to a newspaper. So that's a major threat. Some newspapers are switching to online only. Some newspapers have had to shut down. Newspapers are having to try to figure out and think of new ways to make money. Look at this statistic. As of 2013, there were 1,350 dailies, 1,350 daily newspapers in the U.S. That's down more than 20% from 1940. So we have fewer newspapers today, many fewer newspapers today, than we did in 1940, even though we have way more people now. The population is up over 330 million in 2015. Back in 1940, I don't know what the population was, but it was a lot less than 300 million, that's for sure. In the online world, newspapers have to compete not only against other newspaper websites, but also, as I mentioned, against those news aggregate sites and blogs, citizen journalists, television news outlets. They're all out there in cyberspace, and most people don't really care if I read this report on CNN.com or if I read it in a newspaper. I mean, they don't really care too much. So newspapers have to compete with all those different sites. A citizen journalist, and we talked about this earlier, but a citizen journalist is a layperson who gathers and shares information and news online and via social media, right? People are doing a lot of citizen journalists are working on Twitter. Basically, they don't get paid, but many of them have a lot of followers, and there are challenges there for newspapers and also for us because there are professionalism issues there. There are accuracy issues there. Obviously, citizen journalists aren't held to the same standards as newspapers. More challenges, concentration of ownership. I'm not going to spend time on this. You can read those quotes on your own. But this continues to be a major problem, not just for newspapers, but for news industries as a whole. And really, the problem is for us. I mean, it's not necessarily a problem for them. I mean, we get this the narrowing of voices that I've talked about now over the course of really all 3 lectures that I've delivered. So not surprisingly, given the current business environment, newspaper readership is down, as is advertising revenue. Things are tough right now for newspapers, and it's important to note that, in case you were wondering, well, how much money do they make from advertising as opposed to subscriptions and newsstand sales? They make about 2/3 of their money from advertising. So it's the lion's share of money comes from advertising, and so it's a challenging environment right now for people working in news, and especially in the newspaper industry. All these challenges, especially the online phenomenon, it's been very difficult for a lot of newspapers to adapt, and circulation is down pretty much across the board. We'll see how newspapers adjust in the coming 30 or 40 years. Some people have predicted that newspapers are just going to go away and disappear. I'm not one of the people. I don't believe that. I think there will always be a business model for newspapers, but it's definitely more challenging now than it was, even 15 or 20 years ago. Let's look at magazines. You all, I'm sure, if we were in class right now, I'd ask how many of you have subscriptions to magazines, and typically about half of my students have subscriptions to one magazine or another. Some people are interested in, entertainment stuff, some in sports stuff, fashion, whatever. There are magazines for everything. They're very focused. They have very focused audiences. You've got lifestyle magazines, women's magazines, men's magazines, health magazines, magazines for young people, for older people. I mean, there are magazines for everybody. Just go to the magazine aisle at Barnes & Noble or some bookstore and you'll see what I mean. I mean, there are just hundreds of magazine titles. They're published on thicker, higher quality paper, as I'm sure you've noticed. They have a longer format. Usually the articles are longer, and they're published less frequently, usually monthly, but sometimes weekly, or even quarterly. Brief history of magazines. Much of the history overlaps with newspapers, as you probably could imagine. In 1731, we get the first magazine to actually use the word magazine in its title. It was called the Gentleman's Magazine. In 1732, Ben Franklin published Poor Richard's Almanac. That was published in Britain. In 1741, the first magazine was published in North America. It was called American Magazine. In the 19th century, I'm just giving you some highlights here. In the 19th century, Frank Leslie published several magazines. He was a very successful publisher, and most notably, he published National Geographic, which was first published in 1888. So that makes it, 127 years old. I think it's the oldest magazine that still publishes, if I'm not mistaken. But don't worry, I'm not going to test you on that. Investigative journalism was popularized in the 19th century by the likes of Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, and Upton Sinclair in magazines. They benefited from, I should say, they used the longer formats and the less frequent publishing dates to their advantage. And what they did is they published these long investigative exposés. They dug up dirt on the government and other elites, corruption, and investigative journalism became a major feature in magazines. And the government and others started to call these investigative journalists muckrakers. A muckraker is muck is just dirt, so a muckraker is someone who digs up dirt. And that was a name that was given to them, but it wasn't meant as a compliment, right? Let's look at some of the current challenges for magazines. Similar to some of the challenges that newspapers are going through. Sales are down. People now are online. They figure I can just read whatever I want to read online. And then online readers, we tend to have shorter attention spans. So we don't want the long articles. We want the short, quick-hitting articles. People are busy, so it's making it more difficult for magazines to generate interest and to generate sales. Magazine publishers are now looking for creative ways to stay relevant, and so they're doing some different things to try to increase sales. One thing is that they're using the tablet technology to their advantage. So now you can read magazines on your tablet. You can you can get magazine subscriptions as part of packages with certain media purchase deals. So, for example, my brother recently became an insider on ESPN.com. If you've noticed, if you go to ESPN.com, there are some articles you can't read. They say insider. And this is very common on a number of news sites. It's not just ESPN. But you have to kind of subscribe to get a higher level of membership in order to read all of the content. And so, but here's the thing. If you become an insider on ESPN.com for whatever it is, $15 over 6 months or something like that, then you get a discount on ESPN the magazine, which is ESPN's magazine, obviously. So ESPN is trying to up sales to the magazine by packaging that subscription with the insider account. And so that's one of the things that magazines are doing. And that's it. I told you it was going to be short. Let's make sure. Yeah, that was the last slide. So that's it for Chapter 3. Next time you hear from me, it'll be Chapter 4.